Right, diving in today, and we've got a pretty fascinating area to explore. It's called experimental moral philosophy.
Yeah, whenever you hear experimental and philosophy in the same sentence, it can raise some eyebrows, especially for those of us who are used to thinking about ethics in a more, let's say, armchair philosopher kind of way.
Right, like you've got your comfy chair, a cup of tea, maybe a stack of dusty old books, and you're pondering the nature of good and evil. But here comes this whole empirical approach, bringing in experiments and data and all this stuff that might seem a bit foreign to traditional philosophical inquiry.
Yeah, exactly. And for this deep dive, you've sent us this really in-depth overview from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is just packed with information on experimental moral philosophy. You've got its history, the various methods they use, the big questions they're tackling, and even the criticisms that have been leveled against it. It's a lot to unpack, for sure.
It is. And, our listener today, they've got that philosophical mind, always seeking those deeper truths and rigorous arguments. They're looking for a solid grasp on how this empirical approach actually intersects with that more traditional philosophical way of thinking about ethics. So, in a way, this is going to be like their crash course, a deep dive into the heart of this intersection of philosophy and psychology, where we're going to explore these key debates and findings that are shaking things up in the world of ethics.
And it really did pick up steam in the late 20th century, this whole experimental philosophy movement, or XFI as some call it.
X-Fi, yeah, I like that. Has a certain ring to it. But yeah, so our mission here is to unpack these core ideas of experimental moral philosophy. We want to look at how it uses those empirical methods, the observation, the experimentation, the data analysis, all that good stuff. We want to see how they use those to inform our understanding of morality.
Mhm.
And especially since our listeners coming from that philosophical background, we want to focus on how this experimental approach might change, challenge, or maybe even strengthen the way they think about right and wrong.
I think that's key, right? Because this overview you've sent us, it just immediately brings up some really fundamental questions for anyone doing philosophical work on ethics. How do we reconcile those grand, abstract principles with the often messy, sometimes even contradictory ways that humans actually make moral judgments and behave in the real world?
Absolutely. And, for a philosopher, it might seem a bit counterintuitive to start a discussion about moral philosophy by looking back at the historical use of empirical observation. But that's exactly where we're going to kick things off.
Yeah, it's actually really fascinating. The idea of looking to experience to inform our understanding of morality is not new at all. The encyclopedia points to Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian. He tells this story about Darius, the Persian king, asking the Greeks and the Indians about their burial customs, what they do with their dead. And their answers were wildly different. The Greeks cremate, the Indians, at least some of them, would eat their dead. And Darius used those different responses to argue that morality isn't some sort of universal absolute truth, but rather it's shaped by cultural norms and traditions. That's like an early version of moral relativism right there.
It's amazing how those ancient thinkers were grappling with some of the same questions we're still wrestling with today. And it wasn't just Herodotus. We've got Sextus Empiricus as well.
Oh, yeah, Sextus Empiricus, the skeptic. He was a master at using cross-cultural examples to poke holes in the idea of universal moral agreement. He'd bring up things like the Egyptian practice of sibling marriage, which was considered totally normal back then in Egypt, to show that what's considered morally right or wrong can vary wildly depending on where you are and when you live. So even back then, philosophers were using those observations of real-world human practices to question whether there really are any moral principles that everyone, everywhere, would agree on.
So we see that this idea of using empirical data, it's got a long and rich history, even in moral philosophy. But the kind of experimental moral philosophy we're talking about today that really took off in the latter part of the 20th century. It's got its own distinct flavor.
Absolutely. It was a real turning point when figures like Stitch, Nichols, Weinberg, and of course Joshua Knobe really started to bring a systematic experimental approach to these philosophical questions.
Yeah, so for a philosopher who's maybe more used to working with those abstract principles and concepts, this whole empirical angle might seem a bit unfamiliar. So how would you say experimental moral philosophy differs from simply observing moral behavior, which is something psychologists and anthropologists have been doing for ages?
That's a great question, and I think it's super important for a philosophical audience to really grasp that distinction. The heart of experimental moral philosophy is that it's got philosophers driving the whole empirical bus, so to speak. It's not just about psychologists studying how people behave in moral situations. It's about philosophers coming in and saying, hey, we've got these specific philosophical questions, these debates that have been going on for centuries, and we want to see what empirical data can tell us about them.
So it's like they're taking those age-old philosophical battles, like the one between Kant and Hume, and they're bringing in the heavy artillery of empirical evidence to see if it can help settle the score.
Precisely. They're actively involved in every step of the process, from formulating those research questions to designing the experiments, and of course, interpreting the results and seeing how they connect back to those traditional philosophical debates. So it's all about using that empirical data to address those very specific philosophical concerns.
Okay, that clarifies things quite a bit. It's not just about gathering data. It's about using data to target those philosophical questions head on. So when we talk about experiments in this context, what does that actually look like? It's not like we're setting up some elaborate lab experiment to test the categorical imperative, right?
No, not exactly. Haha. But the encyclopedia does give us a good breakdown of what constitutes an experiment in this field. Typically, it involves some sort of manipulation, like you're changing one aspect of a situation on purpose and then seeing how that change affects people's judgments, their intuitions, or even their behavior. A classic example they use is this study where people who randomly found a dime in a payphone were then more likely to help someone in need. It seems like such a small, trivial thing, but it had a measurable impact on their pro-social behavior.
It's pretty amazing, right? These little nudges can have a real effect. But the encyclopedia makes it clear that experimental moral philosophy isn't solely reliant on those super-controlled experiments either.
Definitely not. Experiments are a big part of their toolkit, but they also recognize the value of other empirical methods. They're not shy about using anthropological observation and ethnography, especially when they're tackling questions of moral relativism.
Ah, yes, moral relativism, the idea that morality is relative to culture or society. It's been a hot topic in philosophy for ages.
Oh, definitely. And the encyclopedia mentions some really great examples of how anthropologists have contributed to this debate, like the work of Ladd and Brandt, who studied the moral beliefs and practices in different Native American communities. Their in-depth observations provided a lot of data that helped us understand just how diverse moral codes can be across different cultures. Similarly, Helen's interviews with the Yoruba people, they offered those rich qualitative insights into their understanding of concepts like good and bad. And that qualitative data, it's so important for grasping those subtle nuances in moral thinking that you might miss if you're just looking at numbers.
Right, it's like getting into the heads of people from those different cultures and seeing the world through their moral lens.
Exactly. And the really cool thing is that the methodological toolbox is always evolving. It's not just those classic experiments or those ethnographic studies anymore. Technology is opening up a whole bunch of new possibilities.
I was just thinking about that. We've got all this new tech that can really change how we study morality.
Definitely. Surveys are still a staple, of course. They let you collect data from those big, diverse groups of people. But now we've got virtual reality and augmented reality, and they let you create these really immersive scenarios, almost like moral dilemmas in a video game. And you can study how people react in a more realistic, though still controlled, environment. It's pretty wild, right?
It really is. I can imagine how powerful that would be. And then you've got neuroscience as well.
Oh, yeah. Neuroscience is really pushing things forward. Researchers are using techniques like TMS and fMRI to study those neural correlates of moral judgment. Essentially, they're trying to figure out what's happening in our brains when we're grappling with those tough ethical choices. It's like peering into the physical mechanisms that underlie our moral reasoning. So the field's really embracing this multidisciplinary approach, looking at everything from those initial gut feelings, those moral intuitions, to those fully formed judgments, the cognitive processes behind them, how they develop over time, and even how they're reflected in our brains. It's quite amazing.
Yeah, it's like a whole new frontier for understanding how we become those moral beings that we are. So we've got a good sense of the historical roots, the unique philosophical angle, and the wide range of methods they use. But for a philosopher who's really wondering about the substance of this field, like, what are those specific questions that experimental moral philosophers are trying to answer, and what kind of data are they actually gathering to answer them?
Well, the encyclopedia helpfully lays out two main types of experiments: direct and indirect. The direct experiments are like taking a philosophical claim, some specific assertion about right or wrong, and then you design an experiment to test it directly.
Can you give an example of that, maybe to make it a bit more concrete?
Sure, let's say a philosophical theory states that it's always wrong to intentionally harm an innocent person. A direct experiment might try to see how widespread that intuition really is, and under what specific circumstances people might be willing to make an exception.
That makes sense. It's like putting those philosophical principles to the empirical test, seeing how they hold up in the real world.
Exactly. Now, the indirect experiments, they're a bit different. They're more about shedding light on the fundamental nature of our moral capacities. They're not necessarily testing a specific philosophical claim. They're more about exploring those basic building blocks of how we become moral beings.
So, like, they're trying to map out the terrain of our moral minds, figure out how we develop our sense of right and wrong, and maybe even what makes us different from other animals in that regard.
Exactly. So you might have studies looking at when children start to understand fairness, or whether that distinction between breaking a moral rule and just violating a social convention, if that's something that's universal across cultures. These indirect experiments, they give us this valuable information about the basic elements of our moral psychology, and that information can then feed back into those broader philosophical discussions.
So one type is like taking those philosophical ideas out for a test drive, and the other is like looking under the hood to see how the whole moral engine works.
That's a great analogy. And the encyclopedia also categorizes this field based on those traditional domains of ethics, right?
Oh, right, like applied ethics, normative ethics, and metaethics. Can you remind us about those again?
Sure. So applied ethics, that's where you're dealing with those very specific practical moral issues, like the ethics of AI or bioethics. Then you've got normative ethics, which is all about those general principles of right and wrong, those big questions of what makes an action right or wrong, and our intuitions about things like moral responsibility and what constitutes a good life. And then there's metaphysics, which is kind of like ethics about ethics. It's delving into those really fundamental questions about the nature of morality itself, like whether there are objective moral truths, the meaning of moral language, and the nature of moral disagreement.
So applied ethics is about the what should we do in specific situations. Normative ethics is about the why should we do it. And metaethics is about the what does it even mean to say we should do it.
Exactly. You've got it. And for this deep dive, especially considering our listeners' philosophical interests, we're going to mostly focus on normative ethics and metaethics. That's where the experimental findings have the most direct impact on those core philosophical debates.
Sounds good. So let's start with one of those central areas of philosophical inquiry, moral intuitions and conceptual analysis. It seems like experimental methods are really shaking things up in terms of how we understand these fundamental elements of moral reasoning.
Definitely. You know, philosophers have always relied on those moral intuitions, those gut feelings about what's right or wrong, as a key piece of evidence for their theories. But now, experimental moral philosophy is taking those intuitions into the lab, putting them under the microscope.
So it's like they're saying, hold on a minute. Let's not just assume that our intuitions are always reliable or that they point us towards some objective truth. Let's see how they actually work and what factors might be influencing them.
Exactly. And one way they're doing this is through what's often called the negative program.
Yeah.
In this program, it's basically using experimental results to challenge the universality and reliability of those intuitions. It's trying to show that they might not be as solid or as objective as we often think.
The negative program.
Yeah.
It sounds kind of, well, negative. But I'm guessing there's a good reason for that name.
There is. It's called that because it's essentially highlighting the potential problems with relying too heavily on intuitions as the foundation for moral theories. And one of the key ways they're doing this is by showing that our moral intuitions can differ significantly based on things like our cultural background or our socioeconomic status.
So it's like saying that if my gut feeling about what's right or wrong is heavily shaped by my upbringing or my social class, maybe it's not really tapping into some universal objective truth about morality.
Precisely. It's raising those questions about whether those intuitions are really tracking moral truth or if they're being swayed by those factors that don't seem morally relevant.
And the encyclopedia mentioned some interesting examples of this, like the research on cross-cultural differences in intuitions about reference.
Yeah, that's a great example. It suggests that even our basic understanding of what certain words and concepts refer to, the very building blocks of our reasoning, can vary depending on our cultural background. And then you've got the work of Jonathan Haidt, who showed that judgments about harmless but offensive actions could differ based on someone's socioeconomic status. It's suggesting that our intuitive reactions to certain situations, they might not be as clear-cut or objective as we often assume.
It's like saying that what might seem like a straightforward moral intuition to someone from one culture or background might be totally different for someone from a different context.
Exactly. And the negative program doesn't stop there. It's also uncovered a whole bunch of what they call normatively irrelevant influences on those moral intuitions. These are things that, on the surface, shouldn't affect our moral judgments, but experiments show that they actually do.
Normatively irrelevant influences. So these are like those sneaky little factors that are messing with our moral compasses without us even realizing it.
Exactly. And they're everywhere.
Right.
Simply changing the order in which you present moral dilemmas to people can affect their judgments, or how you frame the situation linguistically, the words you use to describe it. And even seemingly stable personality traits, like how extroverted someone is, have been shown to correlate with their moral judgments. It's pretty wild.
It's like saying that my moral compass might be more fickle than I thought, getting pulled this way and that by all these subtle subconscious influences.
Right. It's making us question whether our intuitions are really those reliable guides to moral truth, or if they're just being pushed around by all these random factors. And, it goes even deeper than that. Research on the cognitive mechanisms underlying our intuitions has also given fuel to this negative program.
Okay, so we're getting into the nuts and bolts of how those intuitions actually work in our brains. What kind of things are they finding there?
Well, for instance, there's the idea that our deontological intuitions, those strong feelings of don't do X, like those prohibitions against causing direct harm, might be rooted in those quick emotional responses, almost like reflexes. And some argue that if those don't do X feelings are mainly emotional, then maybe we should be more open to those consequentialist approaches, the ones that focus on maximizing overall outcomes, even if it means breaking those rules sometimes.
So it's like saying that sometimes our emotions might be leading us astray, making us cling to those moral rules, even when following them might lead to worse consequences overall.
Right. It's raising those questions about whether a purely rule-based morality is always the most rational or ethical approach.
Yeah.
And then you've got research on moral luck. That's the idea of whether we hold someone morally responsible for a bad outcome, even if it was partly due to chance. Studies have shown that our judgments about moral luck can be heavily influenced by hindsight bias.
Hindsight bias, that's like the I knew it all along phenomena, right? Like after something bad happens, it seems more predictable or avoidable than it actually was beforehand.
Exactly. And that bias can seep into our moral judgments as well. If we only judge someone harshly after a bad outcome, even if they couldn't have reasonably foreseen it, that might be more about our psychology than a genuine moral assessment of their actions. So the negative program is really pushing us to re-examine those assumptions about the reliability and objectivity of our moral intuitions. It's showing us that they might be far more contingent and susceptible to irrelevant influences than we thought.
So it's like saying that our moral intuitions, they're not those infallible guides to moral truth that we might have assumed. They're more like those compasses that can get easily swayed by the surrounding magnetic fields. But the encyclopedia also talks about a positive program. How does that fit in?
Right, the positive program. That's where things get really interesting. It's not just about debunking intuitions. It's about using them, even those seemingly quirky or unreliable ones, as data points to help us build and refine our moral theories.
So it's like those intuitions, they might not be perfect, but they're still valuable clues to how our moral minds actually work.
Exactly. And a great example of this is the work of Joshua Knobe, who's done this amazing research on how moral considerations can actually shape our understanding of everyday psychological concepts, especially intentionality. And this led to what's now known as the Knobe effect.
Ah, the Knobe effect. That's one of those things that once you hear about it, you start seeing it everywhere.
It really is. And it's so simple, yet so profound. So in his classic experiments, Knobe presented people with these scenarios where someone performs an action and it has this foreseen side effect. But the catch is the person says they don't care about the side effect either way. And what Knobe found was this incredible asymmetry. People were far more likely to say the side effect was brought about intentionally if it was a negative side effect, even if the person said they didn't care about it.
Okay, I need an example here. This is getting a bit abstract.
Sure, imagine a CEO who implements this new business strategy. They know it'll increase profits but also harm the environment. And they say, look, I'm just focused on profits. I don't care about the environment. People tend to say, yeah, but you intentionally harmed the environment, even if you didn't actively want to.
That makes sense. It's like, come on, you knew it would happen. How can you say you didn't intend it?
Right. But here's the twist. If that same strategy accidentally helped the environment, people are less likely to say the CEO intentionally helped the environment. It's like our moral evaluation of the outcome, whether we see it as good or bad, is actually influencing how we perceive the intention behind the action.
Wow, that's really interesting. It's like our moral judgments aren't just coming after the fact. They're actually shaping how we see the world, how we understand people's minds and their actions.
Yeah.
The encyclopedia mentions that there's this whole debate about how to explain this effect.
Oh, yeah, there are a bunch of different theoretical models out there. Some say that our concept of intentionality has this built-in moral component, so those bad side effects just fit more naturally with our idea of intentional action. Others say it's more about our motivation to blame, like we're more likely to attribute bad intentions to people so we can hold them responsible. Then you've got models that focus on whether those side effects align with the person's values, or models that focus on those subtle cues and expectations in those experimental scenarios, like the between-the-lines meaning. And some even argue that we think more about the agent's reasoning when they violate a moral norm. Each of these models offers a different angle on what the Nobe effect might be telling us about the complex relationship between our moral judgments and how we make sense of other people's minds.
Fascinating how this one simple effect has opened up this whole area of research. It's like we're peeling back the layers of our moral minds and discovering all these intricate connections. Now, another major figure in this field is Joshua Greene, known for his work on the trolley problem and neuroimaging.
Greene's work has been really influential, no doubt. He used fMRI to study brain activity in people as they were trying to solve those trolley problems.
The trolley problem, the classic thought experiment in ethics. The one where you have to decide whether to sacrifice one person to save 5 others.
Exactly. And Greene's research revealed some really interesting things. For instance, he found that those personal dilemmas where you have to directly cause harm to someone with your own actions, like pushing someone off a bridge to stop the trolley, they trigger much stronger emotional responses, and people are less likely to see them as morally permissible. And this contrasts with those impersonal dilemmas where you're just flipping a switch to divert the trolley, even if the outcome, the number of lives saved, is exactly the same.
Right. It's like there's this gut feeling that directly causing harm is just wrong, even if it leads to better consequences in the end.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about the emotional response. Greene also found that when people did judge those personal actions as permissible, it took them longer to reach that judgment. Like their brains were having to work harder to overcome that initial emotional aversion.
So it's like that emotional response is this initial roadblock, and then the reasoning part of the brain has to come in and try to navigate around it.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And based on these findings, Greene and others, like Peter Singer, argued that those strong aversions to certain types of harm, those aversions that underlie a lot of deontological, moral intuitions, they might be driven by those more primitive emotional responses. And they suggest that a more rational approach, one focused on maximizing well-being, that utilitarian approach, might lead to different conclusions in these scenarios.
But that's a pretty controversial claim in philosophy, right?
Yeah.
Not everyone agrees that an emotionally driven moral intuition is automatically less rational or less morally valid.
Oh, definitely not. Lots of philosophers argue that emotions can be incredibly valuable sources of moral information, shaped by our evolution and our social experiences. They say that just because a judgment has an emotional component, that doesn't automatically make it irrational or less justifiable. And some even challenge that neat distinction between personal and impersonal dilemmas, arguing that other factors might be at play. So while Greene's work has been super influential, those implications are still being hotly debated.
It sounds like this is one of those areas where the experimental findings are really pushing us to reevaluate some of those traditional philosophical assumptions. Now, the encyclopedia also talks about this really interesting approach called the linguistic analogy. For a philosopher familiar with Chomsky's work, this must be really intriguing. Can you explain what that's all about?
Yeah, the linguistic analogy, it's this really cool idea that draws a parallel between our capacity for moral judgment and our capacity for language.
And so it's like how we learn and use language might tell us something about how we learn and use morality.
Precisely. The core idea, which has roots in Rawls' work and draws heavily from Chomsky's theories about universal grammar, is that just as we have this innate capacity for language, this underlying grammar that allows us to understand and produce sentences, we might also have this innate moral grammar that guides our moral judgments.
So just as we have those intuitive feelings about what sounds grammatically correct, even if we can't explain the rules, we might also have these intuitions about what feels morally right or wrong, even if we can't articulate the underlying principles.
That's the heart of it. And the encyclopedia outlines 4 main parallels between language and morality in this framework. First, it's about how children acquire these capacities. Just as kids can pick up language with relatively little explicit instruction, despite that limited and often imperfect input, it's argued that children develop a pretty sophisticated understanding of morality at a young age, also with limited direct teaching.
So it's like saying that both language and morality might be more about those innate predispositions and less about simply being taught the rules.
Right. And the second parallel is about universality. Even though different languages are super diverse on the surface, there's this idea that there are these underlying universal principles or constraints that govern what a human language can be. And the analogy suggests that we might find similar universal, perhaps even innate, principles underlying those seemingly diverse moral codes across cultures.
It's like there's this underlying structure, this deep grammar that shapes both our languages and our moral systems.
Exactly. The third parallel is about those unconscious rules. We all follow those complex grammatical rules when we speak without even being aware of them most of the time. And the analogy suggests that we might be doing the same thing with moral rules, following those intricate principles without necessarily being able to articulate them.
It's like those moral rules are operating in the background, shaping our judgments, even if we're not consciously aware of them.
Exactly. And finally, the fourth parallel is about that generative capacity. Just as our language grammar allows us to produce and understand this infinite number of sentences from those finite rules and vocabulary, the analogy suggests that our moral grammar might allow us to evaluate a vast array of situations and actions using a limited set of moral principles.
It's a really powerful analogy, isn't it? But I'm guessing there are some criticisms as well. Analogies can only take us so far.
Absolutely. And the encyclopedia points to some of those criticisms. For that first parallel, critics point out that children actually do receive quite a bit of explicit moral instruction, maybe even more so than with language. And there's still debate about exactly when children develop what we could call full moral competence. When they're really thinking about morality like adults do.
Right, so maybe the parallel with language acquisition isn't as strong as it first appears.
Maybe not. And for the second parallel, well, those universal moral principles, those are still very much up for debate in philosophy.
Yeah, it's hard to say for sure whether there are those truly universal moral truths that transcend culture and time.
Exactly. And for the third parallel, while we might struggle to articulate those moral rules sometimes, maybe comparing them to those deep unconscious structures of grammar is a bit of a stretch. And then for the fourth parallel, that idea of moral recursion, where we can apply moral principles recursively to generate judgments about ever more complex situations, while the empirical support for that is still pretty limited. So there are definitely some limitations to this analogy, but it's still a really thought-provoking way to think about moral cognition.
And the encyclopedia mentions this argument by Mikhail about the poverty of the perceptual stimulus in the moral domain. Does that tie into the linguistic analogy?
Right. So Mikhail's argument is basically saying that when we encounter those morally charged situations, like those trolley problems, we often make those complex judgments really quickly and effortlessly, even though we haven't been explicitly given all the information. It's like our brains are filling in the gaps using some sort of implicit rules to guide our judgments.
So it's like our moral minds are working behind the scenes, using those implicit rules, that moral grammar, to make sense of this situation, even if we're not consciously aware of it.
Exactly. And he argues that the speed and ease of judgment, despite the complexity of the moral issues involved, suggests that there's this implicit rule-based system at play, this moral grammar that's processing the situation in a way analogous to how our linguistic grammar processes sentences. It's a really compelling idea.
It really is. It suggests that morality might be more structured and rule-governed than we often realize, even if those rules are operating beneath the surface of our conscious awareness. Yeah. Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about cross-cultural experimental moral philosophy. When we take those moral dilemmas and concepts and test them in different cultural contexts, what do we find? Does that universality hold up?
This is where things get really interesting, especially for those who assume those universal, unchanging moral principles based solely on intuition. The negative program we talked about earlier, that's been a major driver of this cross-cultural research. They're really looking at whether moral judgments vary significantly across cultures, and, what they're finding is challenging those assumptions.
So those supposedly universal moral intuitions, they might not be so universal after all.
That's what the research suggests. Early studies with the trolley problem, they actually found a fair amount of consistency across cultures in those basic judgments about direct harm versus side effects. But as researchers started doing those more nuanced studies, looking at different versions of the dilemma, those cultural variations started to emerge. It turns out that things like social structure, religious beliefs, and all sorts of cultural factors can influence how people respond to those moral dilemmas.
So those seemingly simple trolley problem judgments, they're actually tapping into this whole web of cultural beliefs and values.
Exactly. And it goes beyond those abstract dilemmas as well. Even that basic attribution of intention, that Nobi effect we were talking about, that's been shown to be influenced by culture. For instance, in some more traditional cultures, the social status of the person performing the action can actually flip the Nobi effect.
Wait, really? So instead of being more likely to see a high-status person as intentionally causing harm, it's the opposite.
Exactly. It's like those cultural norms about authority and responsibility are shaping how people perceive intentionality. It just goes to show how deeply ingrained those cultural contexts can be in our moral judgments.
It's like our moral minds are being shaped by those cultural forces from the ground up.
It really is. And, the encyclopedia raises this even more fundamental question. Does the very definition of what's moral even vary across cultures?
That's a huge question. It's like, what if different cultures aren't even talking about the same thing when they talk about morality?
Exactly. And research suggests that might be the case. Like studies looking at how the English word immoral gets translated into other languages, they found that those translations often capture a different set of behaviors. It might be more about a lack of civility or violating social norms, rather than those big moral violations like causing harm.
So it's not just that different cultures have different moral judgments. It's like they might have different moral concepts altogether.
Exactly. And some researchers, based on all this evidence, are even proposing that morality itself might not be this universal innate human capacity, but rather a cultural invention, something that's shaped by the specific needs and values of different societies. It's a pretty radical idea, but it makes you think, right?
It really does. And what about those other foundational concepts in moral philosophy, like free will and moral responsibility? Did those seem to hold up across cultures?
Well, that's another area where experimental work is providing some intriguing insights. There's been research showing that there are cross-cultural variations in how people understand and attribute free will, control, blame, and punishment, especially when it comes to the role of external factors versus internal choice. Like, some studies suggest that in certain cultures, people might be more likely to deny that someone had free will if they see their actions as being constrained by external factors, even if the person themselves felt like they were acting freely.
So it's like our beliefs about free will and responsibility might be shaped by those broader cultural beliefs about the individual's place in society and the forces that control our lives.
Right. And some even argue that this whole idea of libertarian free will, the idea that our choices are completely free from any external determination, that might be more of a cultural construct than a universal human intuition. It's definitely making us rethink those philosophical assumptions about those really fundamental concepts.
So cross-cultural experimental moral philosophy is really challenging us to take a step back and question those universalist claims about morality, to recognize that our moral minds are deeply shaped by those cultural and contextual factors. It's a humbling but also incredibly exciting perspective. Now, the encyclopedia also explores how experimental work has impacted our understanding of some other key areas in moral philosophy, like character and virtue, well-being and happiness, the role of emotion, and the idea of moral standing. Let's start with character and virtue. Virtue ethics has made a big comeback in philosophy, but it seems like social psychology has thrown a bit of a